We're going to change the order a bit and move straight on to item 10, which is the pre-notification engagement on home share accommodation regulatory options. We have staff to do a presentation. Mark and Alison.
My name is Mark Stevenson. I'm a team leader in the city planning team. I'm joined by Alison McLaughlin, who's the lead for this plan change. We'll begin by talking through some slides as an overview, and then we'll take questions.
So just as a quick overview of the report, the decision for the committee today is whether or not to proceed with seeking public comment on a range of options for managing home share accommodation in the district plan. Staff recommendation at this time is to proceed with that engagement. Just by way of background, there's been significant growth in home share accommodation in the past 3 years. The most popular areas are around the central city, settlements on Banks Peninsula, other coastal areas, and areas near the airport. Just in the last year, we're aware that on the 2 largest websites, and acknowledging that there's also a number of other websites that we don't have the statistics for, there's been approximately 4,230 listings. About half of those were whole unit and half of them were private room or shared room. And then within those whole unit listings, about a third were available for 30 days a year, up to 30 days a year. A third were available from 30 to 90 days, and a third were available for more than 90 days a year. So that gives sort of a rough indication of the number of units that potentially have may or may not have a permanent resident on the site. So there's obviously a range of impacts from this growth of home share accommodation. On the one hand, it offers more choice for visitors in terms of the location and the type of accommodation they can stay in. There's an opportunity for homeowners to earn some additional income. It's another use for people's existing houses, and potentially it spreads some tourist spending to parts of the city that wouldn't ordinarily see that spending. But on the other hand, it can have amenity impacts on the neighbors, including noise, parking impacts, antisocial behavior. There can be some weakened community ties, especially in neighborhoods that are seeing a high density of these listings compared to the permanent population. Potentially there can be some increases in house prices and rents if a neighborhood's really popular for home share accommodation and also for residents. And there's also some risk that some spending that would be going into the central city might be going to other centers instead. So in terms of the current rules, guest accommodation is permitted in commercial and mixed-use zones and some specific sites in residential zones. Hosted accommodation is permitted for up to 6 guests. In most residential zones is a bed and breakfast. And in the residential central city zone, units up to 40 square meters can be listed as long as they don't employ anybody that doesn't live on the site. But a resource consent is required for whole units in residential zones outside the central city, and in rural zones if it's not part of a farm stay or a rural tourism activity. So there's 5 options that we wanted to get feedback on from the public. So the first option is keep the rules that we have at the moment. The second option is to limit the number of days for whole unit listings. And this is the approach that's been taken by a number of cities overseas, usually in combination with a registration requirement. So as the council will be aware, the council sent a remit to LGNZ earlier this year, asking them to advocate for some sort of central government action on a registration ability. We know that LGNZ has put together a working group that's gone around and had workshops with a number of councils across New Zealand, and they're preparing a paper with recommended policy options, but we don't know at this time when that's going to be submitted to the central government or what action is going to be taken in response to that. The third option is a range of area-based restrictions. So restrictions could be focused on the areas that are most popular, potentially having the most effects. Alternatively, there could be an attempt to sort of focus it into the areas where it's most popular to sort of contain those effects and also support central city spending. Or alternatively, it could be permitted in areas where there's a demand that's not being otherwise met. The fourth option is allowing Airbnb, or sorry, home share accommodation in units that meet specific criteria, which would be sort of around trying to avoid the amenity impacts on the neighbors by requiring sort of more separation for the units that can be listed. And the last option is to treat whole units as a type of residential activity, which would essentially permit it throughout residential zones. So just to sum up, the decision, again, is to go out for further comments on these options. We don't really have any certainty at this point about what's going to happen in terms of registration system, or if there's going to be some other legislation to address some of the issues. And again, in terms of the district plan, it's really managing just the environmental effects of home share accommodation. There's a it sort of sits within a range of other responses that the council could have, but just in terms of the district plan, we can't consider trade competition effects. We can only look at the environmental effects that we can document from the activity. But the council has a range of other options that it could consider once the district plan rules are in place that could also manage some of the other effects that have been highlighted by some of the deputations today. And just in terms of the engagement, we're happy to arrange meetings with everyone. Certainly not the intention with listing the drop-in sessions wasn't to say that's the only engagement that we're going to be doing, so we're certainly welcome to set up meetings by request with anybody who requests them. I think we certainly understand the challenges for people trying to put these submissions together in a short time period, and especially coming out of the Christmas holidays. So I think we could consider an additional 2 weeks for that engagement period. Thank you.
Sarah, then Tim.
Thanks so much for that. I mean, I like the idea of going out, exploring the options and those kind of things at this point. Once we come up with something, is actually enforcing it completely dependent on the government changing the rules so we actually can identify them anyway? So whatever we decide, we need to be able to identify them in some way, and we currently can't.
It's not entirely dependent. We do have ways that we could identify individual sites, but it's very...
It's about a day per site.
It's very labor
really
intensive.
Expensive.
Yeah, and there's a large number of sites as well.
Yeah.
So there's a question of fairness in terms of whether or not we would be enforcing it with every site. So the council would need to consider the cost implications of that additional level of enforcement.
Okay, and do we have any indication at all of what the government might do?
We don't at this time. I just know that the recommendations are being prepared from LGNZ, but we don't know what the response to that is going to be, or
Thanks.
what the timing would be.
Tim.
Thank you. Just a couple of 3 questions. With the graph you've given with the numbers, do we know how the growth has happened over the last few years from the concept of Airbnb and the home share really taking off in Christchurch? Because I mean that is, I think, part of one of the pains for the registered accommodation providers. So do we know, because is that going to be exponential as it goes forward? Is there any work on that? Because obviously it's hurting the associations and the registered owners now, but what is the pain in the future? So it's not getting better, is it, for them?
We've done a little bit of analysis around it, which suggests that there's unlikely to be really significant growth going forward. That it's probably slowing down in terms of the level of growth, but obviously, it's difficult to predict into the future. But definitely, you can see that the rate of growth has slowed in the last 6 months or a year.
With regards to the district plan...
Jump in for 1 second. Could I just ask the presenters just to speak a little bit more clearly into the microphone? Some of the councillors are struggling to hear.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the aspects that hasn't really been covered is the safety aspect, which Bob brought in, and it's certainly something I hadn't kind of run past my mind. I've been too busy looking at the numbers, etc. But it is obviously crucial if we've got a large development somewhere, and one was mentioned in the papers from David with regards to Morehouse Ave, if the fire service do turn up. So if we have blocks of flats, does our district plan require, or can we change it to require the home share Airbnb to have that equipment?
So a number of the health and safety regulations are managed through the Building Act or through the fire safety regulations, which are sitting at the national level. So we'd have limited ability through the district plan to change those. But I think as part of central government's consideration of how to approach Airbnbs, they might be looking at some of those other regulations, but to some extent, how they're managed through those regulations is beyond the council's ability.
I guess my question is, could we put up a plan change for that? Because when I've had flats, etc., and some have been in body corporate, some have been individual, but the ones in body corporates, apart from having smoke alarms, there's no connection. So in a block of 10 or 12 flats, you could have, I could have had 4 Airbnbs, which, it's, whereas if I was a commercial operation with 12 or 8 units, they would all have had to be linked to the fire service.
Those matters of safety are outside the scope of what can be considered by the council under the Resource Management Act, so would be unable to propose a plan change to that effect.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you. And my question probably really follows on from Tim's. I'm keen to drill down into the scope of the discussion document in particular. We've heard from a number of submitters this morning considerations around what you might call level playing field concerns. So rating, building compliance issues, warrants of fitness, those sort of things. The discussion paper really is limited to city planning provisions and noise effects, parking effects, environmental effects, and so on. The question from Tim and the answer to it suggests that there are a number of those issues that we might like to engage on. The rating issue, residential versus commercial, the warrant of fitness type issues, that we might want to engage on. Are you saying that those things are not within the scope of what council can do? Because I would have expected that if we had a plan change that meant we were looking at Airbnb as a regulated activity that required a resource consent, and we thought of it as a commercial activity, then there will be other things that would flow on from that in terms of rating and other regulations. Should we not be engaging on all of those things as well, so that we get a clear view from the people as to what their view of how we should deal with those things are as well?
I think there are other methods that the council could use, including rates, in order to address some of those issues. But a number of those are also quite dependent on having a registration system in order to identify the properties. So the sort of decision isn't foreclosing other actions that the council could be taking. It's really just looking at the district plan as a first step, because we could go through this process to identify what the most appropriate rules are, and then off the basis of that, consider what other methods would be appropriate in terms of addressing some of the issues that were highlighted by the deputation.
So would it then be useful in the discussion paper to be posing some questions as part of the engagement? Do you believe that whole home Airbnb should be treated as a commercial activity? Do you believe that residential units used in this way should be treated with the same regulations that would pertain to commercial units? Do you believe there are other matters we could consider? My thought, having heard what I've just heard, is we probably should broaden the engagement document, do this once, do it well, and then let that inform all of our next stage discussion, which is inevitably, I think, going to involve matters of rating and warrant of fitness compliance.
We can certainly add some additional questions around people's understanding of what would be a commercial, what type of activity would have a commercial character versus what is still primarily a residential character, because I think that's a central question for the district plan provisions as well.
Yep.
And we can
what I wouldn't want was to get to considering the engagement feedback and then be in a situation where there are things that we want to discuss that we can't because they didn't form part of the engagement.
Or we need to go out again. Or
yep. Thank you.
Just to supplement Alison's answer, any change in terms of rating will obviously be subject to a separate process for the annual plan and long-term plan process as well, at which time there will also be an opportunity for people to comment on
Yep.
the appropriateness of
But
our
a
rating
result
policy.
of the engagement could be that we pick something up that we then refer into the annual plan process
Yep.
that was triggered by the engagement.
And certainly comments that are received that are not on the plan change, we can obviously confer with colleagues in other units. Some aspects such as compliance with fire regulations and safety, there's well prescribed requirements, so we just need to ask questions that are going to be perceived as adding value. Some matters that people may feel that they can make feedback on, we don't have an option on because of the prescription in regulations around fire requirements and where fire requirements are triggered.
So we could presumably, though, be asking for comment outside of the options that are presented.
We can certainly ask questions, but we just need to frame those questions carefully.
Thank you. So I guess leading to a question for the Chair, if we were wanting to, I mean, my view would be that we need to amend this to broaden the scope of the engagement to the matters that I've mentioned, and there may well be a view around the table. Certainly I've got a view that we need to increase the length of the consultation period, or maybe change the timing as well. So if I can just flag that as something that we might want to pick up in any resolutions.
Yeah, in the third resolution, there's an opportunity to provide further comment.
Yep.
So we can do that through there, but we may need to put additional information on there, including a few elected members just to sign off that additional comment. Jimmy.
Regarding to the community the engagement, based on the previous deputation, there are particular concern the time frame and also consider the time period. I just want to know, all the comments from this community engagement will be comments from the 16th January to 17th February, that's 4 weeks. Whether we just consider, to fit in our annual plan, long-term plan, this time period, so 4 weeks. Otherwise, whether it's possible to extension to 6 weeks or 8 weeks or not, or we can change a different time period. Consultation.
At this stage in the process, there's not a prescribed time period that is specified in the Resource Management Act or that guides us. Through ensuring that people are well informed and providing the opportunities for people to express their views, we felt that 4 weeks would be sufficient. But having said that, as Alison outlined, we are proposing that it's now extended to 6 weeks. We think, given the nature of this time of year, it's important we also, given the diverse range of users and groups that are affected by this change, that we should bear in mind that over the summer period, we're also potentially attracting interest on this matter from those that are occupying Airbnb, who may not otherwise be here during the summer, outside the summer period. So I think there's some value of doing it now. We're not, certainly we're supportive of extending it by 2 weeks, which would take it into March.
We've already made that change up in the recommendation. Yanni?
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could tell us, once the discussion documents process is finished, before we see any concrete district plan in place, if that's the approach we adopt, when that would be likely to come in?
So once we have all the comments, we'll consider them, we'll do a summary, and then come back to the council as soon as possible in order to make a recommendation on what the preferred plan change would be. Obviously, it depends on how many comments we get. I think we were sort of tentatively hoping to get to the hearing within this year, but then it depends on whether or not, or a decision by the end of the year, by 2020. But it would depend on whether there's appeals and the time period that it takes to resolve those appeals. So there's still a bit of uncertainty there, but we obviously recognize that it's an urgent issue for a number of people, and we would be trying to resolve it as quickly as we can.
Right. So best case scenario, how soon could we get something in place to help address this problem?
We
2 years, or
we'd be aiming to have a decision by the end of 2020, but if there's appeals,
Right.
it could take more time.
so can you just explain to me why we haven't used the regeneration Christchurch approach, given that what we've heard from some of the deputations this morning, and also what we've previously heard as councillors from, actually ironically, some of the same deputations, throughout the last few years? Why can we not use the regenerate Christchurch process?
So in order to use the Regenerate Christchurch Act, we would need to show that what we were proposing achieves the purpose of that act, which is the recovery and regeneration of the city. And I think with home share accommodations, it's a really complex issue in terms of the effects that it's having. So if, for example, and we don't know what the proposed option would be that we would be going forward with, but if the option was around restricting home share accommodation to protect amenity effects, if that had the effect of discouraging investment, then you can make the argument that it's actually working against regeneration. So it's a really complex issue in terms of its relationship to regeneration and recovery, and I think for that reason it's not necessarily a good fit for
I look at the graphs that we've had through the deputations, and I see that it's like this huge wave of change that's coming at the same time where we've known now that getting hotels back, particularly to support the convention centre, for example, has been critical. So I guess I'm sort of struggling to understand why we don't think that it's urgent to use the Regenerate Christchurch powers.
No, the question's been asked and answered, and it's also in the body of the report about the Regeneration Act.
Well, it's like one
Do
sentence.
you have a different question?
Right. So just so I'm clear though, if we wanted to ask Regenerate Christchurch to look at this, we could do that. There's nothing that stops us from doing that. If we wanted it to be addressed with urgency, would that be a quicker process than going through our normal district plan?
I think this report's about proceeding with pre-notification engagement. We will have to come back at a future date with a report on proceeding to notification of a plan change or to use the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act. And so we would, regardless of whether we use the GCRA or the RMA, would be going through this first path of pre-notification engagement. As Alison described, there's tests in the GCRA, and I think in order for the committee to make a decision about use of the GCRA, I think it would be beneficial if the committee had more information on that. I would though take advise a caution. Under the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act, Section 71 does enable an expedited process. Given a contentious issue like this, where there are a range of views that may be expressed, under the GCRA there's no hearing, and ultimately the minister can either accept or decline the proposal. There's not a ability to seek amendments to a proposal. It's either black or white. So having regard to the absence of a hearing and the range of views, there may be some concern from the community, at least, of not being able to verbally present views at a later date that would be available under a plan change process. Having said that, we can provide more information on at a future date.
I think just a final point of clarification out of that response, and thank you, that makes sense. We're going to go out and do the discussion, and then based on that, we can choose what the best process is based on the feedback. Could we have a question that asks people about the urgency and how important this is to the regeneration of the city?
Yeah, we could definitely add a question in terms of the urgency. There's some questions around the significance of the various issues, but there's not one specifically around how urgently it needs to be addressed.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Aaron?
Yeah, so mine's based on the submitters we had this morning that come and spoke to us and the issues they raised. What we're proposing today, how many of those problems or issues will be solved once we go through all of this process?
What we can provide through the process is more certainty for people around what district plan rules that the community agrees are fit for purpose, and on the basis of that, and a greater understanding in the community, be able to, I think there would be, as I said, sort of more certainty for the community about what those rules are. There's, as I said, there's sort of limits to what the council can look at in terms of the things like the Building Act and the fire regulations and registration. But we can at least resolve within the district plan what rules the community thinks are the best.
So,
Will this process get us there? Are we going to end up with this style of accommodation? I won't call it Airbnb because there's a multiple names there, but is that style of accommodation going to be classed as a commercial player, pay a form of commercial rates, they might not be the same, but a form of rates, and have the fire restrictions in place that the others are put under?
So what we would be seeking from the community through their public comments is what, in their view, where that distinction lies between a commercial style or character of home share accommodation and a more residential style, and sort of where that line should be drawn, and on the basis of that.
At the point you pay normally, I would have thought. At the point you pay to stay somewhere would be a commercial definition. Like if I pick up backpackers every night and they just stay at my place for free,
Yeah.
not really an issue.
I mean, I think you can have situations where someone lives in the house full time, they go away on holiday for 2 weeks. Over the course of those 2 weeks, they let out their unit on a home share accommodation site. In terms of the environmental effects of that and the neighbours, is probably quite different to somebody who doesn't live there and lets it out 24/7 all year. So I think what we're hoping to get from the community is some sense of where they think that line is, at what point it starts to have a commercial impact on the neighbourhood and the wider community. And at that point, we would potentially want to require resource consent for it, and then the council could consider if there were other methods that would be appropriate for managing that impact.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. I guess that my questions are more for the consultation team, but you may be able to answer the questions. So just with regards to the timing, following on from the Deputy Mayor's questions, if a body corp, if I understand it right, that is the majority of the dwellings are owned by one organisation, then an annual general meeting, which technically a body corp must meet once every 12 to 15 months. So it's not, I mean, we kind of probably meet more often than most in some of the units we had, but with regards to that, so that the notice for that is 6 weeks for that type, then you've got 3 weeks for an annual general meeting or 2 weeks for a special meeting. So they are legal requirements for a body corporate. So if we're going out for 4 weeks and starting on this, 17th of January, it does seem kind of be really quite hard to organise that with timing over the Christmas period, etc. And if you're looking at a body corp, because that was mentioned by the previous, that there would be a number of body corps that would be interested in this. Technically, if it's a body corporate that's owned or managed majority of those units, the 6 week requirement's almost missed. So I think, going into the recommendations, Mr. Chairman, I think we do have to get some feedback from our consultation team about the timing of that in the early January or mid-January. Thank you.
Do we have a consultation team to answer questions about the length of the...
So the planning team have worked closely with the consultation team. The matter of whether body corporates can submit isn't necessarily a matter of an AGM meeting, but with a month's consultation, and we've proposed to extend it to 6 weeks consultation, we do hope that that would provide sufficient opportunity for any members of the public, whether body corporates or others, to engage in the process. And staff have heard the points raised in the deputations about being out and about, but ultimately it's a matter for council as part of your decision making. If you want to make it longer or make it shorter or change the dates, then that's to your volition. But staff have heard loud and clear, and we've already proposed to extend it to 6 weeks from 4 weeks.
Thanks, Brendan. Okay, if there's no more questions, we've got a set of recommendations?
Shall we change that last one?
That's fine. So Melanie's moved it. Do we have a... You happy with that, Andrew? Just to come through.
Yep.
Do we have someone to second?
Yeah, I'm fine. Happy to. Yep. So it's just the two things that were just mentioned were the widening of the scope and also then the time frame, just extending it out by 2 weeks. So that's both covered. So
Yes.
in which case I'm happy to second if it needs to be seconded. No, all good. Either. All good.
Right, is there any debate? Andrew?
Thank you. I think it's good that we are having this discussion. I mean, the starting point for this is there a problem that we would want to engage with our community on? You know, problem definition is generally a good starting point for any discussion about something that we might want to do. And I think here there is. I mean, Airbnb, peer-to-peer accommodation, realising that this is wider than just Airbnb, that's the brand that tends to be used to describe it, undermines building community in the central city. We've got aspirations about numbers of people living in the central city. The reason for creating residential accommodation is to be building community and having people living there permanently. This type of activity certainly can undermine that, and I think we may be seeing examples of where that's happening. Equally, if we translate this to more traditional communities like Littleton or Akaroa, where there are properties changing hands that have previously been in residential use or have been rented out to tenants under the Residential Tenancies Act, and they then turn over to a new owner or a new use as a peer-to-peer accommodation activity, that not only takes away long-term rental accommodation or owner-occupied accommodation for the community, but it also often has the effect of escalating prices. So in communities like Akaroa in particular, we're seeing this activity starting to reduce both the choice and the affordability of housing which is available for the community. That then has an effect on provision of other services, has an effect on availability of staff for businesses and that kind of thing. So in terms of the problem definition, I think from a planning point of view, certainly there are some issues that we might want to identify and think about how we resolve. And then what were described earlier really as the level playing field issues are also issues I think that we need to turn our minds to. The fairness and parity in rating and also the building warrant of fitness and regulatory matters. So they're all things that, as I mentioned in my line of questions earlier, I'm keen to pick up in this discussion document, and paragraph 3 in front of us certainly allows that to happen. So I certainly support this going out for engagement as a first step in considering how we deal with a number of issues that it raises, certainly realising that this activity isn't going to go away. There is a move away from traditional accommodation provision, but we need to be looking at how the traditional accommodation sector and this method of providing accommodation can continue to exist side by side in a level playing field environment. And my view, reflecting some of Councillor Jani Johansson's comments, are that we need to be getting on with this quickly. The sooner we can get some fairness and quite possibly some regulation and some planning changes around this, the better. So I'm going to be supporting this today. Pleased to see the amendments that have been made to the original resolution as set in the paper, and encourage others to do the same.
Thank you, and I want to thank the submitters. One of the things that didn't even cross my mind was the safety aspect, and I think that's just so obvious. So thank you very much for reminding me of that one. Well, I think when I kind of sat down here and I looked at the resolutions, I was kind of wondering, did we need to know where we wanted to be before we started? And I think the consultation, and I'm very pleased that it's extended to 6 weeks, I think we'll get that, and I do hope there's a simple question for those taking part in it. Do you regard this as a commercial activity, and if so, should it be rated as such? A very simple question, because I think sometimes we ask a question in a roundabout way in a lot of circles. So I think one very simple question. amongst others, would be a really good way to go forward. I will support this today. I think we've got to move forward. There is an urgency here. We're in a bit of a downturn globally with tourism, etc. So I think that the slowdown is just a blip in the system, and it will ebb and flow as we go forward. So I think it's going to grow. I think it's going to grow exponentially unless we look at the problem and solve it. And I think the consultation that we go through will help us with those in our community telling us where we should go and where we should end up with this. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to briefly say I agree with Andrew's comments that we should extend this consultation to become a whole of issue process and a whole Airbnb consultation as a whole. And I also agree with Yanni's comments that if Hagley Park counts as should count for consideration under Section 71, then there's no reason that supporting a local hotel and motel industry shouldn't be the same. And I think that point has been captured by the extra question that'll be added by staff. And I look forward to considering the best possible process for getting the quickest and most robust plan changes that we can enact, along with the work we'll continue to do working with central government. And staff can expect me to be in contact today or tomorrow about setting up some meetings with those resident groups.
Excellent. On that note, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Thank you.